Welcome to the Captains of History podcast. In this episode, Julius Caesar begins his rise up the Cursus Honorum, while Rome simmers with revolution. After returning to Rome in early 74 BC, Caesar managed with the help of his influential relatives to have himself appointed to a significant priesthood. This was a prestigious, yet far less restrictive post than the priesthood Marius and Cinna had intended for him. Caesar's mother Aurelia had a brother named Gaius Aurelius Cotta, who was consul for the year preceding and had occupied this pontifical seat before his death. It was not unusual for the offices of pontifices to elect relatives of dead priests to fill the vacant spaces. Caesar was also aided by the fact that his commanding officer, when he won the civic crown, Publius Servilius Vatia Isauricus, was among their number. The appointment was a great honour and a boon to Caesar's fledgling career. The priestly offices formed an inner elite of the Senate, and were generally held by men of patrician or noble birth. His elevation marked him out as an up-and-coming man in Roman politics, one destined for the very highest offices. At his return, he was also elected a military tribune, and it is possible he served under Publius Licinius Crassus in the Third Servile War against the renegade gladiator Spartacus. However, there is no conclusive evidence that this was the case. Caesar continued his charismatic attacks on former Sullans in the law courts and won popular acclaim for his obvious popularis leanings. However, Caesar did not display the radical tendencies of other young and ambitious aristocrats such as Lucius Sergius Catilina. His acceptance into the heavily pro-Sullan pontifical offices also shows us that at this stage he was a part of the traditional senatorial aristocracy, even though he showed populist sympathies. He was not at this point what he would soon become, the hero of the popularis cause. In either 70 or 69 BC, Caesar won his first election in the Cursus Honorum, when he was elected a quaestor in his year. It was an important sign of success to be elected to a magistracy in the earliest year the constitutional settlements allowed. Caesar was 30 years old and beginning the long journey that would lead to immortality and fame beyond that which any Roman had ever secured. For his quaestorship, as was customary, he served a proconsul governor in administering one of the provinces, in his case Hispania Ulterior, or further Spain. However, before he left, Caesar was hit by a personal tragedy when both his Aunt Julia and his wife Cornelia died in quick succession. Caesar had shown himself greatly devoted to his wife Cornelia by incurring the further enmity of the dictator Sulla when he refused to divorce her. She also bore him his only ever legitimate child, a daughter named Julia. Her death, just at the beginning of what promised to be an exciting and stellar career, must have been a blow for Caesar. He held two grand public funerals for both women. Great public funerals were common for the elite of Rome, as they were large public relations events wherein the deeds of ancestors and of the dead could be widely advertised to the voting populace. Caesar's decision to hold one of these grand funerals for his Aunt Julia was not a surprise, for she was an elderly woman, wife of the great Gaius Marius, and a Julian by birth. However, his decision to hold a similar funeral for Cornelia was unique, for she was still young and had not been the wife or mother of anyone as yet important. Plutarch states that this was the first time in Roman history that one had been held for a woman so young. The event shows the genius of Caesar, for in his sorrow we can be fairly confident lay genuine and heartfelt feelings for the loss of a beloved wife. It also proved to be a hugely popular decision and showed the people that Caesar was a loving and deeply saddened husband. Such was Caesar's character that he broke with old traditions and did so in a way that improved his popularity and standing with the at heart staunchly conservative Roman people. It was also during the funeral of his aunt Julia that he famously displayed the symbols and images of Marius and his victories. Marius was still held in great affection by the people, and this added to Caesar's popular image. In further Spain, Caesar performed his role of quaestor brilliantly, so much so that 20 years later he would still be remembered and have friends in the province that would prove valuable to him. Upon return to Rome, he remarried, and the woman that Caesar chose to marry also demonstrates his political astuteness, for she was none other than the granddaughter of the dictator Sulla. With one hand, Caesar evoked the popular hero, and with the other, he married kin of Marius's bitter enemy. He thereby ingratiated himself with both people and senate, populares and optimate. The marriage between Caesar and Pompeia also shows the incredibly complex political and ideological loyalties in Rome. It was never as simple or as straightforward as the modern left or right distinction, and we should be wary of falling into the trap. For in Rome, the political was personal, and one's personal ambition came above any political ideology or leaning. At this point, piracy had become a topic of much debate and discussion in Rome. Rome relied on overseas grain to feed its teeming multitudes, and the pirate threat had grown so vast that it was seriously impacting grain shipments to Italy. The piracy problem had been left to stew and grow because of the complex relationship between the pirates and the Roman slave economy. However, a tribune and friend of Pompey, Aulus Gabinius, called for an empire-wide commission for one man to tackle the threat. Pompey was not mentioned by name in the bill, but it was clear to all who the bill was aimed at. Pompey was a man who had broken every convention of traditional Roman politics. Inheriting his father's army when he was just 19, he had proven himself an invaluable lieutenant of Sulla's and earned himself the nickname of the Young Butcher. He had destroyed the Marian forces in Sicily and Africa, after which his troops began comparing him to the similarly youthful Alexander the Great, a great hero for the Romans, and Pompey adopted the cognomen of Magnus, meaning the Great. Pompey had then brilliantly defeated the Sertorian rebellion in Spain, and while on his way back to Rome, had finished off the last of the slave host that had escaped from Crassus's legions. While Crassus had done the bulk of the fighting and secured victory, Pompey claimed the victory for himself after he massacred the few thousand survivors. This created a lifetime of bitter enmity and loathing between Crassus and Pompey. Throughout his career, Pompey would routinely be accused of stealing the glory from other generals just as they were wrapping up their theatres of war. Although he had been a chief supporter and beneficiary of Sulla, Pompey quickly became a popular hero, and throughout his life he would swing between the two unofficial camps. Pompey and Crassus quickly became the most important men in the state, and their rivalry looked sure to bring about fresh civil wars. However, before Caesar's quaestorship, the two ran together on a joint ticket for the consulship. During their stay in office, they reinstated the power of the tribunes and people's assemblies, a markedly anti-Sullan act which again highlights the complexity of Roman politics. Caesar was a supporter of both men. Crassus was famous for his immense wealth, to which he put to good purpose by sponsoring the political careers of promising but poor aristocrats. Caesar was one such man who Crassus funded liberally throughout his entire life. Caesar also supported Pompey and spoke actively in favour of the bill to grant him imperium against the pirates. The bill was passed by an assembly of the people, and Pompey was granted an extraordinary command over the entire Mediterranean world, an unprecedented, if necessary, act. Within weeks, Pompey had destroyed the pirate menace and was acclaimed by the people of Rome as their hero. Another bill was passed not long after, which Caesar equally wholeheartedly supported, stripping Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a patrician aristocrat and another lieutenant of Sulla's, of his command of the Mithridatic War and giving it instead to Pompey. Pompey would spend the next few years winning glorious victories in the East. His conquests must have inspired Caesar and also shown him, if he did not already know, that military glory was essential in becoming the first man in Rome. Pompey was only 6 years older than Caesar, but had already won such a reputation for himself that he would go down as one of the greatest of the Romans. Caesar, along with every other ambitious aristocrat, must have been somewhat piqued by the great man. In 65 BC, Caesar was voted as aedile, 2 years before the legal age to which the Sullan constitution allowed, by being given a special dispensation from the Senate. This was not entirely unusual, but Caesar's own already successful career, political influence from familial relationships, and his own charisma must have played a part. Ideals were responsible for the upkeep of Rome herself, and in the sponsoring of public entertainment and festivals for the populace's enjoyment. The position was not mandatory for the cursus honorum, but enabled aspiring men to make a great name for themselves by putting on massive games paid for out of their own pocket. In Caesar's case, as in other men's, the money likely came from lenders like Crassus and other such wealthy and influential men. Caesar, showing his natural flamboyance and utter determination to always be the best and the biggest, spent vast sums of money on his games. He held gladiatorial funeral games in honor of his long dead father that were so extravagant that a law was passed in response, putting a fixed number on the number of gladiators one could have per game. Although there is absolutely no suggestion that Caesar intended to use these vast numbers of gladiators for a violent coup and seizure of government, this surely must have been in the minds of the legislators. One of his last gestures during his time in office was to erect all of the trophies commemorating Marius's victories over the German invaders back up in the Forum Romanum, a move wildly popular with the people of Rome, but most decidedly unpopular with the conservative senatorial elite, particularly with Quintus Lutatius Catullus, the Princeps Senatus, an unofficial leader of the Boni, raising the stakes. The most significant event in Rome during this time was the Catiline conspiracy, which culminated in the year of the consulship of Cicero. Caesar played both an open and antagonistic role in the build-up to the actual conspiracy, but a far more murky one behind the scenes. Whether he was involved in the conspiracy was greatly debated at the time and continues to invoke discussion among historians and authors. For there were many similarities between the two men, Caesar and Catiline. Both were young men of the highest patrician birth, yet born into families of relatively little political importance. Both were on a mission to revive the auctoritas of their ancient family name. They were both primarily in the Populares camp and associated themselves with Marius. They were both heavily indebted, although Catiline to a greater extent than Caesar. However, their differences were manifold. Catiline was brash, aggressive, and extremely radical in his desperation, whereas Caesar was cunning, charming, and more moderate in his beliefs and temperament. Caesar was significantly involved in a particularly vicious, hostile, and odd attack on the senatorial elite. He and another man, Titus Labienus, accused an extremely elderly senator called Gaius Rabirius of the archaic and long disused crime of perdulio, a sort of more serious version of treason. The punishment, if found guilty, was crucifixion. The old man was accused of murdering a tribune of the plebe, whose bodies were sacrosanct and inviolable, Lucius Appius Saturninus, which had occurred when Marius had been consul some 37 years before. For this particular crime, the only appeal was to the Comitia Centuriata, the whole Roman people. As Saturninus had been a popular demagogue and hero, the likely outcome for the old man was not good. Caesar was judge and noted for being openly hostile to Rabirius, while Cicero defended the man. It ended in an odd way, with guilty all too obvious. The flag for a foreign invasion was raised on the Janiculum Hill, and all on the Campus Martius abandoned the field and returned to the city. While it ended with nothing to show for it, it does indicate Caesar's growing stakes in the race for power and his hostility to the Optimates. Rumours and hearsay over a plot by the radical populist faction, symbolised by Catiline, swirled around Rome for several years. Catiline stood, unsuccessfully, for the consulship and racked up even greater debts. Crassus and Caesar both supported his consulship and were seen as active supporters. They were, and have been since, accused of being the real wire pullers behind the scenes of this plot. However, it does seem unlikely. Crassus, for one, was the richest man in Rome and made a fortune through money lending. One of the key rallying cries for these radicals was the cancellation of all debt, something which could not be in Crassus's best interest. For Caesar, he was only at the beginning of his career, and though a leading light of the Popularis cause, he was in no position to want a complete overthrow of the state. In all likelihood, both men were playing the cards close to their chest and waiting for events to unfold before they made any decisive actions. Both men would play leading roles in the drama that was to unfold so memorably during the consulship of Cicero in one way or another. Pontifex Maximus. The office of Pontifex Maximus, Supreme Pontiff, was the highest position in the Roman religious hierarchy and the chief priest of Rome. A position of the highest honour, dignity, and religious sanctity. The post usually went to older, venerable senators who had served as consuls and demonstrated a lifetime of duty to the state. There were, of course, always exceptions, but it was generally this way. The election of this most prestigious of religious officers had just recently passed from the remit of the Senate, as Sulla had decreed, back into the hands of the traditional tribal assembly. In fact, Caesar had been an active campaigner for this bill, and when it passed, he announced his own candidacy for the post. Now, the leading and most revered senators of the day were in contention: Quintus Lutatius Catulus, the Princeps Senatus, and Publius Servilius Vatia Isauricus, Caesar's old military commander. Both were eminent men with extremely high dignitas and auctoritas. Caesar, on the other hand, was still a young man, and though he had had an eventful young career so far, he still lacked the level of auctoritas and clout of men such as Catulus and Isauricus. Therefore, he was a rank outsider with no real right to win. However, Caesar was already a popular champion, unlike men like Catulus or Isauricus, and the tribal assembly was infamously corruptible. Caesar took out enormous loans, which he used for campaigning, primarily, it seems, bribing the key men of each tribe. At some point, it became clear to Catulus that Caesar was a genuine threat, and offered him a huge sum to pay off his debtors if he would drop out of the race. However, this backfired, and Caesar, sensing weakness like a shark smells blood in the water, took out an even larger loan and doubled down on his bribery and his campaigning. He had raised the stakes to newfound levels. Either he would win and a long career of fame and fortune beckoned to him, or his debtors would crush him until he was nothing. Caesar knew this, and famously, as he left his small house in the Suburra On the day of the election, he kissed his mother Aurelia and told her he would either return as Pontifex Maximus or he would not return at all. We have two different accounts of the election itself from Plutarch and Suetonius, one of whom claims it was a close run affair and the other that it was a landslide. Either way, Caesar had won. Against the odds and putting everything he had on the line, he had been victorious. It must have been a euphoric moment for Caesar. His gambler's instincts, his boldness, his decisiveness, his determination to never back down, his growing contempt for the old customs and conventions of the Republic and its leading men were on full display. As Pontifex Maximus, he would be at the very heart of the state, involved in all of its rituals and religious festivals. The post even came with a house on the Via Sacra, no more a denizen of the Suburra, but at the top of the Capitoline Hill overlooking the city. No one could ignore him now. He was the chief priest of Rome and visually present at the heart of Roman political life. The conspiracy comes to a head. The victory of Caesar in the race for Pontifex Maximus was a sideshow compared to the real political question raging throughout Rome. Would Catiline win the consulship, and what would happen if he did or if he didn't? In the consular elections, he ran again, with the backing of both Crassus and Caesar, although his radical policies and desperate actions had meant that he had lost most of his patrician and senatorial backing. Again, he lost, and due to his ruinous debts, began fomenting unrest throughout all of Italy. An old Sullan officer named Manlius was raising forces in the countryside. Inside Rome, a plan was formulated to assassinate leading senators, such as the new consuls and Cicero, and take over the Roman state. Crassus and other men came to Cicero with letters purportedly from the conspirators warning them to leave Rome ahead of a planned massacre. Also in Rome was a deputation from the Allobroges tribe from Roman Gaul, who the conspirators attempted to foment in aid for the conspirators. These Gauls alerted their patron, who in turn made Cicero aware. Cicero took the news to the Senate and exposed the conspiracy. Its ringleaders, save Catiline, were arrested. These were a mixture of noble yet indebted men and adventurers seeking to gain wealth and power from the conspiracy. It included eminent men such as Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura, the stepfather of Mark Antony. Catiline had fled to his growing army in the countryside, and senatorial forces were sent to deal with him. In the meantime, the fate of the arrested men was the highest priority. Rome had no system of prison or long-term confinement. Punishment was either financial, corporal, or capital. For leading men of the Senate convicted of crimes, exile was the usual recourse. However, these men had planned to murder the consuls and overthrow the state. They couldn't be allowed or trusted to simply go into exile. A great and famous senatorial debate occurred, with the leading senators all calling for immediate execution. That was until Caesar stood up and spoke. He was in a precarious position, for he was an open supporter of Catiline's consular ambition, a known popularis ally, and had been linked with the actual conspiracy itself. Crassus, who had also been linked with the conspiracy, was conspicuously absent, and it would have been the easiest and safest option for Caesar to press for the harshest of punishments to distance himself from the conspiracy. That is what a lesser man would have done, but not Caesar. He argued passionately and charismatically in favour of imprisonment, either for life or pending trial. Such was the magnetism of Caesar that we are told he had won the house round to his point of view, much to the distress of Cicero. It was only the rousing, bombastic, and cutting speech made by the young Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Younger, a man who would go on to be the bitterest enemy of Caesar, who won the house back to execution. It was decided the men would die without facing trial, completely illegal, although the Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimatum, something which Cicero would later be made to suffer for. Although Caesar had not been successful, he had demonstrated that he was not like the usual rung of men. He would not be swayed by majoritarian persuasion or fear for his life. Though many suspected he had been involved, Cato stated the most plainly in a speech Caesar would not be cowed and would stand firm behind his own beliefs and principles.